In this episode, we take a step back from incident response and recovery mechanics and look at the engine room that makes many of those outcomes possible, the Security Operations Center, SOC. Beginners often picture a SOC as a dark room full of screens where experts watch hackers in real time. But that movie image is not helpful for leadership. A real SOC is a set of people, processes, and technologies organized around one core job: detect, understand, and respond to security-relevant activity in a way that protects the business. To do that well, the SOC must have a mission and scope that fit the organization's real risk and real maturity, not someone else's ideal. If the mission is vague, the SOC becomes reactive and chaotic. If the scope is too broad, the team drowns in noise and fails to protect what matters. If the scope is too narrow, the business carries blind spots that attackers can exploit. Defining mission and scope is therefore leadership work because it determines what gets protected, how quickly threats are handled, and how resources are spent. A SOC mission is a clear statement of purpose that explains why the SOC exists and what outcomes it must deliver for the business. A useful mission is not a slogan like "Stop all threats," because that is impossible and sets the team up for failure. A useful mission describes measurable outcomes, such as providing timely detection, coordinated triage, and incident response support for the systems and data that matter most. It also clarifies how the SOC relates to other teams, because the SOC rarely does everything alone. Some SOC teams focus on monitoring and triage, while other groups handle deeper investigation, remediation, and longer-term security engineering. Leaders should define mission in a way that prevents confusion about responsibilities, because confusion causes delays and duplicated work during real incidents. A clear mission also helps set expectations with executives, because executives need to understand what the SOC can realistically deliver and what trade-offs exist. When mission is clear, the SOC can prioritize the right work and build confidence over time. Scope is the set of boundaries that define what the SOC watches, what it responds to, and what it does not handle directly. Scope includes technical coverage like which networks, cloud environments, endpoints, and applications are monitored, and it includes operational coverage like hours of operation and escalation responsibilities. Beginners often assume scope should include everything, but everything is not a scope, it is a wish, and a wish can create a false sense of security if the SOC is spread too thin. A realistic scope starts with the business's critical assets and risks, such as customer data, financial systems, identity infrastructure, and high-availability services. It also accounts for the organization's maturity, because a new program may need to start with core visibility and triage discipline before it can expand into advanced detection. Leaders should treat scope as a commitment. If you claim you monitor something, you must have the telemetry, alerting, and response process to act on it. Overclaiming scope is dangerous because it creates blind confidence, which is worse than honest limitation. Business risk should be the primary driver of SOC scope, because the SOC exists to reduce the likelihood and impact of the risks the business actually faces. Risk is not just about threats. It is about how threats intersect with the organization's assets, operations, and dependencies. For example, an organization with high reliance on customer-facing services may prioritize detection of availability and integrity threats, while an organization with sensitive personal data may prioritize detection of data access and exfiltration. Leaders should use risk thinking to decide where the SOC invests effort, such as emphasizing identity monitoring, endpoint visibility, cloud activity monitoring, or third-party integration monitoring. Risk thinking also helps prioritize which alerts matter, because high-risk asset signals should be treated with more urgency than low-risk asset noise. Beginners sometimes treat the SOC as a technical function that chooses tools and alerts, but scope should be grounded in business consequences. When the SOC's daily work maps to business risk, it becomes easier to justify investments and easier to explain value. The SOC becomes a business protection function, not just a security gadget operator. Maturity is the second driver, because SOC mission and scope must reflect what the organization can execute reliably. Maturity includes the quality of logging and telemetry, the clarity of incident response processes, the availability of skilled staff, and the organization's ability to act on findings. A SOC that generates many alerts without the ability to respond effectively creates alert fatigue and distrust, which can weaken security rather than strengthen it. Leaders should therefore evaluate readiness honestly. Do we have centralized logging? Do we have asset inventory? Do we have defined escalation paths? And do we have authority to take containment actions? If those foundations are weak, the SOC's initial mission might focus on building visibility and triage discipline rather than trying to detect every advanced threat. As maturity grows, scope can expand into richer detection, proactive hunting, and more automation. The leadership lesson is to build a SOC that works today and can grow, rather than building a SOC that looks impressive but fails under real conditions. A mature mission respects the organization's current capability while pushing it forward intentionally. A crucial part of defining scope is deciding what kinds of events the SOC handles, because security-relevant activity includes both true incidents and many false signals. The SOC's job is to reduce uncertainty quickly by triaging alerts, confirming what is real, and escalating appropriately. That means the SOC needs clear criteria for what constitutes an incident, what constitutes a security event that requires investigation, and what constitutes routine noise. Beginners often assume that every security alert means an attacker is present, but many alerts reflect misconfigurations, benign scanning, or expected operational behavior. If the SOC treats everything as urgent, the team burns out and misses real threats. If the SOC dismisses too much, the business remains exposed. Leaders should therefore define the SOC's triage responsibilities and the handoff points to other teams, such as when an event becomes a formal incident, when it requires specialized forensics, or when it should be routed to IT operations for remediation. Clear definitions keep the SOC focused and prevent it from becoming the dumping ground for every technical problem. The scope should align with the organization's ability to act, because detection without action is not protection. Telemetry and visibility are also part of scope because you cannot monitor what you cannot see, and leaders must connect mission statements to data reality. A SOC typically relies on logs, endpoint signals, network telemetry, identity and authentication events, and cloud audit trails, often collected into a security information and event management (SIEM) platform. The details of tools matter less than the design principle. The SOC needs reliable, timely, and protected evidence streams from the assets it claims to defend. Beginners sometimes assume installing a tool equals visibility, but visibility also requires correct configuration, consistent coverage across environments, and retention that supports investigation. Leaders should insist that telemetry is mapped to critical assets and to high-risk actions, because that is where detection provides the most value. They should also consider integrity of logs, because attackers may attempt to disable logging or tamper with records to hide activity. When telemetry is incomplete, the SOC should acknowledge the gap and treat it as a program improvement target. Honest scope includes honest visibility limitations. Hours of coverage and response model are another important scope choice because the business's risk does not always match a standard workday. Some organizations need continuous monitoring because they operate around the clock or face high threat, while others can accept limited hours with clear on-call escalation for high-severity alerts. Beginners sometimes assume a SOC must be staffed 24 hours a day to be legitimate, but continuous staffing is expensive and can be wasteful if the organization lacks the maturity to use it effectively. Leaders should decide coverage based on risk, the speed at which harm can occur, and the organization's capacity to respond outside business hours. If critical systems can be compromised quickly, or if incidents can cause rapid customer harm, then delayed detection may be unacceptable. If systems are less sensitive and strong preventive controls exist, a different model may be acceptable. The key is to define the model clearly and ensure that escalation paths work in practice. A SOC that monitors but cannot wake the right people when it matters is not fulfilling its mission. Another major scope decision involves the relationship between the SOC and incident response, because these functions are closely linked but not always the same team. Some organizations have the SOC own the entire incident response lifecycle, while others have the SOC handle detection and triage, and then hand off to a dedicated eye or team for containment and recovery. Leaders should define this relationship explicitly so that everyone understands who owns the incident timeline, who coordinates communication, and who has authority for containment actions. Beginners often assume handoffs happen naturally, but handoffs are where incidents slow down because information is lost and responsibility becomes unclear. A mature scope includes clear handoff criteria, shared documentation practices, and rehearsed coordination. It also includes agreement on what evidence the SOC must capture before handing off, because early evidence is often volatile and critical for later investigation. When the SOC and IR roles are aligned, the organization responds faster and with less confusion. Alignment is a scope outcome because it defines boundaries and interfaces, not just tasks. It is also important to define what success looks like for the SOC, because without success measures, mission and scope remain abstract. Success measures should reflect outcomes like reduced time to detect, improved time to triage, fewer false positives for high-priority alerts, and improved incident handling quality. They can also include coverage measures, such as whether critical assets are logging correctly and whether telemetry gaps are shrinking over time. Beginners sometimes measure success by counting alerts processed, but high alert volume can indicate poor tuning, and it can reward busy work rather than risk reduction. Leaders should choose measures that encourage the SOC to focus on high-value signals and on improving detection quality. Measures should also reflect collaboration, because the SOC depends on other teams to remediate, and poor coordination can make detection worthless. When success measures are aligned to business risk, the SOC can demonstrate value in language executives understand, such as preventing customer harm or reducing downtime. This also supports investment decisions because leadership can see which improvements produce real benefits. Scope must also include decisions about proactive work, because mature SOC teams often do more than respond to alerts. They also hunt for threats, improve detections, and reduce attack surface through feedback to engineering teams. However, proactive work should match maturity, because hunting without foundational visibility can become guesswork and produce low value. Leaders should decide how much proactive work is realistic and ensure that proactive findings feed into program improvement, such as tuning alerts, closing gaps in logging, and strengthening identity controls. The idea is that the SOC becomes a learning function, continuously improving its ability to detect meaningful threats. Beginners often treat the SOC as a static monitoring function, but static monitoring tends to degrade over time as systems change and attackers adapt. A mission that includes continuous improvement helps the SOC stay relevant and effective. This is also where lessons learned from incidents should feed back into the SOC's detections and playbooks. The SOC becomes a mechanism for institutional memory. A common misconception is that buying a SOC service or building a SOC team automatically reduces risk, but risk reduction depends on how well mission and scope align to the business and how well the SOC can actually act. If the SOC is watching the wrong assets, it will miss what matters. If the SOC generates alerts without authority or support to contain, it becomes a noisy messenger rather than a protective force. If the SOC is measured on volume rather than outcome, it may optimize for activity rather than impact. Leaders should therefore treat mission and scope definition as a foundational governance step, not as an administrative formality. The organization should also revisit mission and scope as maturity changes, because what is appropriate for a small, growing program is different from what is appropriate for a mature environment with complex cloud and third-party dependencies. Revisiting scope is a sign of maturity, not indecision. A SOC that evolves intentionally is far more effective than a SOC that freezes in its initial shape. When you bring all of this together, defining a SOC mission and scope becomes a practical exercise in aligning detection and response capability to real business risk and real organizational maturity. The mission states the outcomes the SOC must deliver, such as timely detection, disciplined triage, and coordinated response support for critical assets. The scope defines what is monitored, how coverage works, what the response model is, how handoffs occur, and what success looks like in measurable terms. Risk drives where the SOC focuses because it determines what matters most, and maturity drives what the SOC can reliably execute today while still improving over time. When mission and scope are clear, the SOC becomes calmer, sharper, and more effective because it knows what it owns and what it does not. It can tune signals toward what matters, coordinate action with the right teams, and demonstrate value in outcomes rather than in noise. That alignment is the real foundation of security operations, and it is exactly what a security leader must be able to articulate and defend.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.